You stand in a line that does not so much move as it shuffles, grudgingly, like a centenarian rising from a cold bench. The air around you is a dense mix of sun-baked stone, powdered dust, and the faint bitterness of distant olive groves. Ahead, the marble steps of the Acropolis lead upward with the same indifference they have shown for more than 2 millennia. They do not care who treads on them, barefoot slave, crowned ruler, sandal strapped tourist, or you, with your quietly sweating palms and the dull knowledge that there is still a very long way to go. Somewhere above, beyond the columns and shadows, stands the Parthenon, its walls guarding what once was the pride of Athens, the statue of Athena Parthenos. But between you and her lies the slow geography of patience, a queue that snakes past crumbly retaining walls under the full assault of the Attic sun, across flagstones polished smooth by countless souls. The pace of this pilgrimage is not heroic, it is absurdly mortal. You step forward, and nothing changes except the angle of light on the nearest stone. The voice of history arrives, uninvited, and begins its work. It speaks in a dry monotone, the kind that might lull you to sleep if your shoes were not already carving slow blisters into your feet. This hill, it tells you, has seen more than just visitors. It has been the stage for the Persian sack of Athens, when flames licked the early temples until nothing remained but blackened marble skeletons. It has watched the rise of the so-called Golden Age under Pericles, when the city poured wealth into stone and art, like a gambler throwing coin after coin into a rigged game. It has endured the Peloponnesian War, that long exercise in futility where Athens and Sparta ground each other into exhaustion. The victors left with nothing more than ruined alliances and a bitter taste. Yet, for all that, the cult of Athena persisted. The goddess of wisdom, war, and craft remained lodged in the Athenian mind, as immovable as the bedrock of the hill itself. You can almost imagine the old festivals, the Panathenaic processions, climbing this very slope, their woven peplos carried like a banner, the air thick with the sound of flutes and the murmur of prayers. But imagining it does not make the line move any faster. The marble steps ahead gleam with that soft, deceptive light of ancient stone. They are older than your country, older than your language, older than the unbroken chain of days that brought you here. Each slab has endured centuries of feet, earthquakes, and careless restoration. Somewhere in their veins are the faint scars of chisel marks made by stonemasons whose names no one remembers. They built for gods, but the gods are gone, and now their work supports the shuffle of tourists and the occasional dropped water bottle. You glance to the side and see the city sprawling below, a tangle of whitewashed houses, rust-red roofs, and distant hills swallowed in haze. The modern noise is muted up here. Athens feels like a backdrop, a place painted in behind the marble and sky, as if the hill has always been the main character. The thought is oddly comforting and also faintly cruel. Civilizations rise, burn, rebuild, decay. The hill stays. The sun inches forward, marking the passage of time, with a kind of malicious precision. The queue advances by 1 or 2 paces. Someone coughs somewhere far behind you. You imagine this wait as a miniature reenactment of Athenian history, long stretches of stasis punctuated by brief, inconsequential advances. It is the sort of thought that might make you laugh if your throat were not so dry. The voice of history, still with you, offers another tidbit. The Parthenon that you see now is not the first temple to Athena on this hill. Earlier versions were demolished or burned, victims of war and weather alike. The one that still stands, even in its fractured state, was conceived as both a religious center and a treasury. Gold and silver once lay within, alongside the colossal statue that was your destination. The irony that something meant to embody divine wisdom would be used to store earthly wealth is not lost on you. The Athenians, practical in their piety, knew that gods and politics often share the same roof. Step by step, you inch forward. The marble underfoot radiates heat back into your legs, and the light bouncing off the pale surfaces forces your eyes into a narrow squint. You think about the labor it took to drag these blocks up the hill, the wooden rollers, the ropes, the straining men. They hauled stone as you haul yourself now, slowly, inevitably, toward the same crest. It occurs to you that the queue is its own quiet ceremony. Every person in it moves according to an unspoken ritual: wait, advance, pause, sigh. Perhaps it is not so different from the Panathenaic procession after all, except there are no priests, no flutes, no incense, only the smell of warm dust, the groan of knees, and the relentless sun. The hill rises ahead. The steps do not shorten. The Parthenon waits, unmoved by your impatience, its pale columns like an unfinished sentence. You continue forward because there is nothing else to do. The heat thins as you cross the threshold, and the air inside the Parthenon takes on that hollow mineral weight that belongs only to places older than memory. The sun, so aggressive outside, now filters through gaps in stone and broken lintels, scattering faint blades of light across the floor. Your footsteps echo with a strangely personal resonance, as though the sound belongs not to you, but to the building itself. The queue is still here, though narrower now, winding like a tired river through the long hall. The crowd speaks in whispers, as if everyone understands that raising a voice here would be an offense, not against other visitors, but against the stone. Marble walls rise on either side, immense slabs veined with faint gray patterns that look like the slow work of centuries pressed into rock. You run a hand along one and feel the unevenness, the ghost of chisel marks worn almost smooth by time. History, which never asked for your permission to speak, continues in its flat, ironic tone. The Parthenon was raised in the 5th century before the Common Era under the leadership of Pericles. It was meant not just as a shrine to Athena, but as a statement, an announcement carved in marble that Athens was wealthy, cultured, and untouchable. The architect Ictinus and his colleague Callicrates designed its proportions with maddening precision, curves so slight They are almost invisible, corrections for the way human eyes distort straight lines. These subtleties were not for the gods, they were for the humans standing in awe, convinced they were seeing perfection. You shuffle forward a few steps. The floor beneath you is smooth in some places and fractured in others, as if the building cannot decide whether it wishes to endure or crumble. The smell in here is faint, but layered: dust, old stone, and something that might be the lingering memory of incense burned long ago. The acoustics carry the scrape of a shoe or the faint cough of someone many paces away. It feels as though the building is listening. The walls, despite their stillness, have moved over the centuries. They have seen fire scorch their surfaces when the Parthenon became a Christian church, with frescoes painted over the pagan reliefs. They have felt the hum of foreign prayers when it was converted into a mosque under Ottoman rule, the call to worship rising above the city. And then they trembled under the deafening explosion in the 17th century when Venetian cannon fire ignited the Turkish gunpowder stored here. That was when the roof collapsed, the sculptures were blasted apart, and the statue you came to see was already long gone. The light shifts again as you move farther inside, cutting across the fluting of the massive columns. These are not merely supports, they are the bones of the building, each drum of marble placed with absurd effort. Imagine the workers on the hilltop pulling at ropes, aligning each piece so perfectly that the seams almost vanish. They were not building for themselves, they were building for an ideal, for the illusion of permanence. The irony is that their perfection has endured mainly as ruin. The voice of history grows more specific, almost indulgent. The sculptor Phidias, who oversaw the decoration of the Parthenon, was more than a mere artisan. He was a kind of architect of vision. It was he who would later create the Athena Parthenos, the statue that once dominated this space. But before the goddess could take her place, the temple itself had to be finished, and so craftsmen spent years coaxing shape out of quarried marble, carving metopes and friezes that told stories of gods and giants, centaurs and heroes. All of this so that visitors, citizens and foreigners alike, would feel the weight of Athens's cultural supremacy before they had even spoken a word. You pause as the queue halts yet again. A stray current of cooler air brushes past, hinting at the shaded heart of the building ahead. In this half light, the walls take on a texture that seems less like stone and more like old parchment, as though they might be read if only you knew the language. The thought is a fleeting one, quickly replaced by the more pressing sensation of time stretching thin. Marble, for all its solidity, is a slow witness. It has no voice, no memory, as humans understand it, yet it holds the traces of tools and the stains of accidents. It does not tell stories willingly, it allows you to guess them. Here, within these walls, you are standing inside a deliberate statement that beauty can be calculated, proportioned, and preserved. That belief has faltered more than once in the centuries since, but the stones have not stopped standing. Your eyes follow a shaft of light as it crawls across the floor, illuminating a fragment of carved relief, perhaps part of a procession, a foot or a fold of drapery. The details are eroded, almost gone, but still enough to suggest what once was. You think about how much is missing, how much is only guessed at now. Somewhere ahead lies the space where the statue of Athena once stood, towering above visitors, gold shimmering in reflected water. But for now, you are hemmed in by marble and shadow, waiting for the line to inch forward. And so you move again, 2, perhaps 3 paces, toward the darker core of the Parthenon, carrying with you the quiet realization that the building itself is the first relic, the shell in which all other relics once lived. The walls do not seem to notice you. They have seen too many others. They will see many more. You stand again, and the line does what lines do when they are inside a famous ruin. It hesitates, arranges itself into little islands of patience, and then pretends to move. The corridor narrows, the light thins to a pale wash, dust motes floating with the pomp of slow comets. Your feet have learned the ritual by now. Advance a few steps, stop, breathe, stare at stone that has already been stared at by generations who likewise believed that reverence could be manufactured by endurance. History clears its throat beside you, a discreet, bureaucratic sound. It reminds you that once there was a door beyond which the goddess waited. Not flesh, not breath, but a composite splendor, ivory for skin, gold for raiment, polished stones for eyes, a spear that winked in lamplight, a shield that gathered myths the way a ledger gathers debts. The name for it is cumbersome and exacting, a word that tastes like a museum label, chryselephantine, gold and ivory, the luxury of a city pledged to a deity that was also its own idea of itself. You picture the workshop where the sculptor Phidias oversaw the making. Not romance, not wild inspiration, but a factory of careful hands. Hammer and chisel, glue and dowel, heat and clamp. Sheets of gold were not welded to the goddess. They were fitted like clothing, removable, countable. The city loved its wisdom, but it trusted its accounting more. Inventory lists were inscribed. The value could be checked. If war or famine struck, the metal could be reclaimed, melted, repurposed as coin or pay for soldiers. The goddess was thought of as eternal. The wardrobe acknowledged that eternity is expensive. The queue shuffles 3 steps. A hush passes over you like a soft reprimand. You think about the ivory panels that formed the face and hands. Ivory cracks. Ivory drinks water from the air. So the ancients, practical as ever, are said to have kept a shallow basin at the feet of the statue, maintained with clear water to humidify the room and soothe the material. The reflection would have doubled the gold, turning a single radiance into 2, a trick of optics passing for wonder, and yet wonder is always a trick of something: air, light, expectation. You become aware of the acoustics again. Someone coughs, very far away, and the sound folds over itself and returns as a whisper. These stones prefer murmurs. They have had enough of proclamations. You rest a hand on a column drum and feel the slight chill of marble that has never warmed to any human. It reminds you that devotion is less a flame than a discipline, The Athenians knew that. The festivals marched on schedule. The sacrifices were tallied. The priests did not encourage ecstasy, they encouraged order. The voice of history, pleased with its own steadiness, continues. In the years when the statue was new, people spoke of it as if it were a miracle of presence. The helmet carried a sphinx and griffins. The aegis showed the head of a monster whose gaze shattered courage. The shield told crowded stories, battles of Greeks and Amazons, perhaps a sly portrait or two of contemporary figures, disguised as myth. There were rumors that Phidias had hidden his name in there, or even his own likeness. There were charges, too, allegations of impiety and embezzlement. Democracy, like the sea, has tides and undertows. Artists who stand too close to power find themselves pulled into both. The line pauses. Behind you, a soft scuffing of shoes. Ahead, the thinning light heavily suggests an important threshold. You imagine, obediently, what a first sight must have done to the nerves of a visitor. The room would have been darker than this ruin is now. Flames would have trembled in their bronze holders, making the gold breathe. The goddess would have towered calmly, a stillness large enough to absorb the flicker. You, small, would have measured yourself against her and found your size accurate, negligible, but counted. That is what cities do when they are at their most confident. They build scales to weigh the soul and call them temples. The thought wavers, a mirage on a stone desert. You remember that the statue is gone. No amount of waiting can produce a vanished object. The record of it is a quilt of sources, a few descriptions by writers who wanted to impress, a handful of copies in marble or on coins, fragments of scholarly quarrel stitched across centuries. There are even late stories that the statue survived long enough to be moved, carried away from Athens, and displayed in another imperial capital, then lost, perhaps to fire, perhaps to neglect. The endings of great things are always crowded with perhaps. You move forward another modest handful of paces. The walls feel nearer. Your breath fogs briefly on the cooler air. You find yourself counting not in numbers, but in episodes. First the making, then the glory, then the haste of history to turn everything into a different use. Once this was a sanctuary, later a church nave, later a powder magazine, later a ruin that learned to charge admission. Every roll leaves a residue. You step through layers of old intentions, the way a diver passes through thermoclines, each with its own temperature of meaning. On the right, a carved fragment shows the hem of a garment and the suggestion of a sandaled foot. Even this anonymous detail carries the stubborn poise of the classical, drapery that seems to weigh nothing and yet falls with perfect logic. You think about the hands that made such fluencies from stone. Apprentices fetched water, masters corrected lines. Time in that room must have felt both urgent and endless. A deadline for a festival, a belief that a work for a god should not acknowledge hurry. The contradiction was simply endured. History, always ready with a corrective, notes that the goddess of this city was not only wise, she was useful, patron of weavers, strategist in war, advisor in councils. Her statue, then, was not merely devotional furniture. It was the emblem of civic identity, a mirror for ambitions, and a guard for anxieties. Citizens could come and see themselves confirmed. Foreigners could come and learn the lesson the city wished to teach, that order and beauty together make a claim to rule. The queue concedes another small advance. The sensation of waiting has thickened into substance, a jelly in which thoughts move with slow dignity. You begin to notice how the dust on the floor is not uniform. Some areas are swept by the constant sliding of shoes. Other corners keep a fluff of untouched grit, delicate as frost. On a ledge, a moth, confused by all this stone and hunger for light, trembles its paper wings. Even small life seems temporary in here. Only the building appears indifferent to the length of its own story. You attempt, dutifully, to imagine the face, not the surly, elaborately beautiful mask of a modern reconstruction, but the ideal filtered through craft. Eyes set slightly wide, the calm that borders on the impersonal, the mouth unbothered by the troubles of mortals who queued before you with offerings and prayers. Perhaps the ivory once shone with a soft moisture that made it seem almost alive. Perhaps the gold made that every other shade recede into obedience. Perhaps there was music from outside, a flute or drum, and it entered the room like a tame animal and lay at the goddess's feet. You are aware now of the paradox that has followed you since you stepped onto the slope. You have come to see what cannot be seen. You have paid for absence, yet the absence is crowded with details, and the details behave like presence. This is the ideology of ruins, learned over centuries. If you supply the patience, the stones will supply the authority. Between the two, a ghost is persuaded to appear. The line halts so completely that you can hear your own breathing. Somewhere, a guard speaks in a low voice that carries no words, only the contour of instruction. You look up into the dusky geometry of beams and wonder how many roofs this space has known, how many times the sky has replaced timber and tile. The building has survived not because it resisted change, but because it consented to it with the weary elegance of an elder statesman. It has agreed to be used, misused, praised, pillaged, studied, fenced, scaffolded, adored. And if the statue truly stood here, if it truly looked down on the citizens, the way a lighthouse looks down on a restless harbor, then it knew the strange intimacy of power, to be close to everyone and belong to no one. The gold was pledged to the city, the gaze to no one at all. That seems, even now, like a kind of mercy. A human ruler would have turned that room into a court. A goddess required only attention. Another ripple of motion. The line exhales, contracts, moves. You find yourself close to an arch of shadow that signals not a doorway, but a boundary between degrees of expectation. Two more clusters of visitors stand ahead, each convinced they are almost there. You test the idea of almost, and it dissolves on your tongue like a sugar that has been in the air too long. Around you, the walls wait, and they are very good at waiting. History, perhaps tired of its own confidence, softens its tone. It admits that much of what it has told you is reconstruction and reasonable inference. The water basin is plausible. The measurements are plausible. The shield's decoration is plausible. The accusations against the sculptor are plausible. The fate of the statue is merely possible. There is humility in this admission and relief. Certainty would have ended your line early. Uncertainty allows it to continue. You breathe. You listen to the soft rehearsal of footsteps, the little prayers that people make to their own patience. Somewhere a coin falls and rings once, twice, and then becomes another part of the hush. You think about the golden plates that could be removed and weighed. You think about the ivory that needed humidity and care. You think about the hands that built all this, and the hands that dismantled it, and the hands that now hover over guidebooks as if paper could serve as ritual. When at last the line offers you another small mercy of forward motion, you accept it without triumph. You let yourself be guided toward the heart of the building where the goddess is not. The absence is not a void, it is a carefully furnished emptiness, draped in scholarship and longing. You cross its threshold in the only way that makes sense here, slowly, dutifully, like someone arriving to keep an ancient appointment with an idea that has outlived its image. It begins not as a sight, but as a clearing in the air. The shadows arrange themselves differently, as though aware of your approach. The cue fans slightly, releasing you into a wider chamber where the light is less a matter of brightness and more a matter of texture. It does not pour in here, it hovers, thinned to a pale gold that remembers the sun without admitting it fully. The coolness is deeper, layered with the faint breath of stone that has not been touched by weather in centuries. Here, in the imagination you have been carrying, is where the statue once stood. It is not there now, of course. What is here is a space shaped by memory and stubborn architecture, high walls whose inner faces have been stripped of decoration, a floor that feels both level and somehow sloped toward the absent figure. The emptiness is deliberate. It has weight. Your eyes, searching, keep trying to fill it, but whatever image you summon seems too small. History leans in beside you, speaking softly as if the walls themselves might listen. When the Athena Parthenos was new, the first impression was designed to overwhelm. Even the largest mortals are small in a room built for a god, and Phidias understood scale as a kind of theology. Gold panels, joined and polished until they could catch every tremble of torchlight, would have turned the goddess into a living beacon. The ivory flesh, face, hands, feet, would have gleamed softly, as if the skin itself breathed. Drapery cascaded in measured folds down to the base, each crease calculated, each shadow managed. In one hand she held Nike, the winged figure of victory, small yet regal, a goddess within a goddess's grasp. In the other, a spear stood as a vertical axis, steady as a law. The shield leaned against her side, its surface carved in crowded relief, battles of myth, the push and pull of figures frozen in permanent struggle. At her feet, the coiled form of a serpent, sometimes said to be Erichthonius, a king born of earth, guardian of Athens's destiny. The helmet on her head bore a sphinx at its crest, flanked by griffins, as if the goddess required her own sentinels. You imagine the first visitors, their necks bent back, their eyes adjusting from the bright court outside to this chamber's orchestrated gloom. They would have seen the goddess rise from the earth like a promise. They might have thought of the Panathenaic procession, the long walk uphill, the gift of the woven peplos, a ceremonial garment that would be offered to her, carried high on a mast, like a ship's sail through the city. Everything about her was symbolic, and the symbol was always twofold: beauty and authority, ornament and order. The present room offers none of this except the scale, and yet scale alone does something to the senses. You stand still, and the air seems to tighten around your ribs. There is a sensation of being measured, weighed against a standard you cannot see. The marble blocks, pale and silent, form a kind of vault around your thoughts. History's voice loses its ironic edge for a moment, as if even it is not immune to the charm of what once was. It tells you how the statue's gold was carefully recorded, how the pieces could be removed for cleaning or, in desperate times, melted for currency. It recounts the debates among scholars over whether the basin of water at her feet was there for practical preservation or optical enhancement. It repeats ancient descriptions of the way the goddess's eyes seem to follow visitors, though no mechanism for this has ever been proven. You step forward until you stand at what must have been the viewing point, the place where the design, the lighting, and the line of sight all came together. The floor here feels subtly different underfoot, perhaps more worn, as if even after the statue's disappearance, people still pause instinctively at this exact spot. You look into the emptiness and try to layer the image over it. The gold, the ivory, the spear, the snake, the shield, the tiny figure of Nike. Your mind's reconstruction is imperfect, a patchwork assembled from descriptions and museum replicas, but for a moment it feels convincing enough to cause a tightening in the chest. There is a peculiar irony in seeing nothing and still feeling watched. The space holds that sensation the way a vessel holds water. The goddess is absent, but her architectural throne remains, and the geometry insists you acknowledge it. The walls are high, the ceiling far, the proportions such that your gaze keeps returning to the center even when you try to study the corners. Somewhere in the folds of history, the statue vanished. Perhaps she was dismantled, her gold stripped, her ivory repurposed. Perhaps she was carried off as a trophy to another city, where she met her end in some unrecorded disaster. Fires consume gold and ivory differently. Gold survives as lumps and droplets, ivory curls and blackens into fragility before crumbling entirely. In either case, the result is the same: absence. Yet here in Athens, in this room, the absence behaves like presence. You feel a shift in the air as others around you move, step closer, take photographs of the nothing. It strikes you that these images will look the same for everyone: a wide, empty space framed by marble. The real souvenir is internal, stitched together from imagination, hearsay, and the slow work of standing here long enough for the architecture to have its say. History resumes its wry tone, noting that in later centuries, when the building's purpose changed, the space was altered. Altars for other gods, pulpits for sermons, even ammunition caches have stood where Athena once did. And yet the shape of the room still hints at a figure in its center, like a footprint that remains after the sand has shifted. You let your eyes wander upward to the fractured beams, the way the light sneaks in through narrow breaks. The shafts fall across the walls like diluted memory, more suggestion than illumination. This is how ruins communicate, indirectly, through what they no longer have to show. You take a final step toward the imaginary statue, aware that the cue will soon usher you toward the exit. You do not bow, but you feel the impulse to. It is not reverence for a deity you have never believed in, but for the craftsmanship of belief itself, the ability to make something so convincing that its ghost can still command a room centuries after it has vanished. The air here is neither warm nor cold. It is the temperature of stone that has been indoors for too long to remember the weather. You inhale it slowly, as though it might carry some trace of the old incense, the torch smoke, the murmured prayers. All you receive is dust, faint and impersonal. When you finally turn to go, you catch the room at the edge of your vision. It looks no different than it did when you arrived, but you are aware of a change, not in the space, but in your own sense of its scale. It feels larger now, as if the goddess's absence has grown while you were watching, and you realize that this is the quiet trick the place has been playing all along, making you believe that an empty space can expand without moving a single stone. The queue leads you toward a narrower passage, and the chamber recedes behind you, swallowing its light, keeping its silence. You do not look back. In some part of your mind, the goddess is still standing there, and you would prefer not to catch her moving in the corner of your eye. You step out of the inner chamber, and the air shifts again. It is not warmer yet, but it is looser, as if the walls have stopped pressing in. The light ahead is broader, louder, more ordinary, and it makes the gloom behind you seem more deliberate, a pocket of controlled darkness tucked into the belly of the Parthenon. Your footsteps sound sharper now, the echo shorter. The cue, that patient organism you have inhabited for so long, begins to dissolve. People drift into smaller lines that lead toward other doorways, toward the long slope back to the open air. As you pass through the colonnade, the sun reasserts itself with the confidence of something that has been waiting for you. Its heat presses into your shoulders, and you feel the stone under your feet grow warmer with each step. The brightness has the blunt quality of midday, flattening the shadows, making the broken sculptures and fractured pediments look less like history and more like debris. The marble is the same material inside and out, but here it glitters as though it has forgotten solemnity. History walks beside you still, unwilling to let you go without a final lecture. It recounts the Parthenon's later centuries, how the temple became a Christian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary, how frescoes of saints were painted over the pagan scenes, how the rhythms of liturgy replaced the processions of the Panathenaea. It speaks of the Ottoman years, when the building became a mosque and a minaret rose awkwardly from one corner, and of the long, quiet decades when the Parthenon stood simply as a building that people used without fanfare, its original purpose already receding into legend. And then comes the story of its wounding. 17th century, a war between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. The Parthenon, by then a gunpowder storehouse, took a direct hit from Venetian artillery. The explosion tore through the roof, shattered columns, and sent centuries of sculpture crashing to the ground. Whole myths were reduced to rubble in the space of a few heartbeats. The air must have been white with dust, and the shock would have rolled down the hill like a physical thing. What had taken decades to build and centuries to endure was ruined in an instant, a reminder that permanence is a fiction marble likes to tell itself. You walk slowly between columns that still stand despite all that. Their fluted shafts rise like patient sentinels, the capitals worn but intact. The missing sections do not diminish the structure so much as make its endurance more obvious. The gaps are part of its anatomy now. Ahead, the city sprawls out in a pale haze, the rooftops tilting toward the horizon. The streets are narrow ribbons in the distance, the sound of traffic faint, almost imaginary. From this height, Athens looks as though it is leaning on the hill for support. You think about all the centuries in which the hill was the city's crown, its watchtower, its claim to the gods. Now it is an artifact, a place people climb not for ritual, but for reassurance that the past was real. As you descend the steps, you find yourself behind another line, not as rigid as the one inside, but still a slow trickle of movement down the worn path. The stones here are uneven, and each dip feels like a deliberate trap for the inattentive. You step carefully, imagining the countless feet that shaped these hollows. Festival dancers, priests in procession, soldiers returning from campaign, masons carrying tools, merchants with baskets. The sun catches the side of a column, and for a moment it glows like something alive. You blink, and it is only stone again. Such tricks are brief, but they are the kind ruins specialize in. The place gives you just enough to think you have seen something extraordinary, then folds it back into the ordinary before you can prove it. History keeps speaking, but softer now. It notes that the statue you came to see is long gone, and yet the space it occupied is still one of the most visited in the world. People will stand in line for hours to look at a void, to breathe the air where gold and ivory once stood. Museums can show reconstructions, textbooks can print engravings, but none of those can give you the sensation of standing in the absence itself. That is what the Parthenon offers, a container for something no longer there. You pause halfway down to turn and look back. The columns frame the sky in tall, irregular stripes. There is no statue visible from here, no hint of the room you stood in moments ago, yet you feel the pull of it. It is an odd magnetism, not of beauty, but of proportion. The building's lines draw the eye upward, and the mind follows, imagining what once filled the apex of that view. The lower you go, the more the sounds of the city rise to meet you. The faint honk of a car horn, the sharp clink of cutlery from a cafe terrace, a burst of music from an unseen window. The world reasserts itself in these ordinary noises as if to remind you that your appointment with history is over. You are back in the long continuum of the present, which has no cues except the ones we make for ourselves. By the time you reach the base of the hill, the heat is thicker, the air more restless with motion. The marble steps are behind you, and the line you joined hours ago still coils its way upward, a living thread of anticipation. New faces, new hats, new bottles of water. They will make the same slow climb, stand in the same rooms, see the same emptiness, and each will carry away something slightly different, stitched from imagination and endurance. You glance once more toward the summit. The Parthenon stands there, as it has stood through war, fire, religion, neglect, and preservation. It will stand through more. The statue it once guarded may be gone, but the building continues to serve its strange new role, a monument to the act of remembering itself. It asks nothing of you except that you come, stand, and see, and perhaps, when you leave, that you carry away a small portion of its silence. You walk into the city's streets, the Acropolis shrinking behind you. The thought comes, slow and certain, that you did not fail to see the statue. You saw exactly what there was to see. You saw the absence, and you saw how well it has been kept. In the end, that is all any ruin offers. Not the thing itself, but the space where it once was, still holding its shape against the erosion of time. And in that space, the goddess remains, not in gold, not in ivory, but in the architecture of expectation. She stands as long as people are willing to imagine her, and you suspect that might be longer than any column, any wall, any hill.